1947, 47 Indigenous children disappeared during a school trip from Elmridge, Montana. No alerts, no records, just silence. The event was quietly erased, buried beneath bureaucracy. But in 1992, a retired sheriff stumbles upon a name, a phrase long forgotten. What he uncovers pulls at a thread that unravels a truth no one was ready to face. It was the kind of Monday morning where the wind scraped against the wooden walls of the Elmridge Public School like it had a warning to deliver. April 14, 1947. The sky above Rockfield, Montana, was a dull gray, not stormy, just quiet, the kind of quiet that settles right before something goes wrong. At 7:35 a.m., 3 yellow buses rolled up the dirt drive to the east wing of the school, where a separate, modest building stood slightly detached from the main structure. This was where the 47 children of the Northern Ridge Indigenous community were taught, separate but not equal, always a little removed from the town's eyes and memory. The students filed in that morning, many carrying small overnight bags. They had been told on Friday that they would be going on a special 3-day educational excursion. There had been murmurs among the parents, confusion mostly, some protest, but the school administration had sent home typed letters on official stationery, complete with the superintendent's signature. It looked real enough. More importantly, it came with consequences for refusal. Any child who didn't go would be marked truant and potentially removed from the educational register. That kind of threat hit hard in families already battling systemic neglect. Inside classroom 3B, their teacher, Miss Meredith Klein, a pale, nervous woman in her late 30s with dark circles under her eyes, stood near the coat rack. She avoided eye contact with the children that morning. Usually warm and open, Meredith's voice was clipped, her movements stiff. "Line up when your name is called," she instructed without her usual lilt. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the clipboard, calling out the roster one by one, checking each name with a faint nod. At precisely 8:10 a.m., the buses left Elmridge grounds. There were no police escorts, no banners or signs of a school trip, just 3 buses and 47 children, ranging from 7 to 13, headed toward an unnamed destination on the East Road out of Rockfield. By noon, phone calls began to trickle into the school office. A few parents had tried to visit the school, only to be told their children were off-site. But when pressed for details, where exactly had they gone, who was supervising them, the school receptionist grew vague. "It's a district-organized initiative," she repeated. "It's been cleared by the state." By the next morning, concern turned to confusion, then to quiet. No buses returned, no phone calls came in, and by Wednesday, April 16th, the town of Rockfield had already started forgetting. There were no posters, no alerts, not even a single mention in the local Rockfield Gazette. The disappearance wasn't framed as a disappearance. It was simply unspoken. Parents from the Northern Ridge community were told there had been a clerical mistake in documentation. No one would take responsibility. When a few tried to file complaints at the sheriff's office, they were told to check with the school board. Within 2 weeks, the entire building that once held the Indigenous classes was shuttered. Officially, it had been restructured for budgetary efficiency. The windows were boarded and the signage was removed. Within 6 months, the existence of those 47 students had been reduced to a line item buried in a forgotten ledger. Even the district's end-of-year school photo omitted them entirely. It was as if they had never walked those halls. What few people knew or remembered was that Miss Klein never returned to her post. She wasn't listed as transferred, nor did she resign publicly. Her small apartment above the town bakery was cleared out by the landlord 2 weeks later. A note was left behind on a torn page of a gradebook. "I did what I had to do. I hope someday they forgive me." Years would pass, the world would change, but in Rockfield, that silence would hold. Generations would grow up attending the same school, walking the same paths, never knowing there had once been a group of children who simply vanished from its walls. The few who remembered, the elders from Northern Ridge, spoke of it only in hushed tones, not out of superstition, but out of a quiet, burning grief. They called it the Spring Without Return. In the spring of 1992, the town of Rockfield looked nearly identical to how it had 4 decades earlier. The same brick courthouse stood at the town center, the same rusted signage hung above the diner, and the same wind swept through the pine-covered hills just north of town. Stanley Cross, now 62, had retired from his long-held position as sheriff only 6 months earlier. He had grown into a man of habit, someone who enjoyed the quiet dignity of early coffee and long walks down roads he once patrolled. He never imagined that a funeral, of all places, would be the setting for a whisper that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the place he called home. It was a small service held behind St. Agnes Church, a modest gathering for a man he barely knew, a farmer named Elmridge who had passed in his sleep at 89. The guests were mostly older folks from the northern outskirts, a blend of long-settled white families and members of the Northern Ridge Indigenous community. Stanley hadn't planned on staying long, but something about the muted grief in the air made him linger. As the final hymn echoed across the graveyard, he noticed an elderly woman seated on a wooden bench near the edge of the cemetery. Her back was slightly hunched, her silver braid tied tightly behind her head. She looked fragile, yet her eyes held a defiance that hadn't dulled with age. As people began to leave, Stanley found himself standing just close enough to hear her murmur to the air, or perhaps to the man in the grave, "We never forgot them. 47 little souls, gone that spring like the snow never melted." The words hit Stanley like a cold slap. Not the number, not even the grief, but the tone. It was too certain, too real to be senile reminiscing. He waited a moment before approaching, unsure how to frame his curiosity. "Marn said, maybe I said it too often." "Ma'am," he said softly, "did you say something about 47 children?" The woman looked up slowly. Her eyes sharpened the moment they met Hisley. "You from Rockfield?" she asked. "Born and raised," Stanley replied, still cautious. "Then you should know, unless they made you forget too." Her words echoed long after he walked away. That night, back at his home on Elder Creek Road, Stanley went through the old albums he had kept from his school years. Class of '52, 5th grade, Mrs. Tuller's class. He remembered the group photo clearly, the one with the crooked flag and the chalkboard sign. He pulled it out, inspecting it with new eyes. 31 kids, all white, all smiling nervously, in a semi-organized cluster. He flipped to his 6th grade photo, then 7th. Not a single Indigenous student, not even in the background. That struck him as odd. The Northern Ridge settlement had been around for generations. He remembered passing their community on the way to hunting trips with his father. Why hadn't they been in class with him? Driven by a restlessness he hadn't felt since his early days on the force, Stanley visited the old school building the next day. Elmridge Public School had changed little. The main building had a fresh coat of paint, but the layout was the same. However, the East Wing, the one that once housed the annex classrooms, had long since been repurposed into a storage area. He asked to see the archives, explaining his former title with a dry chuckle. The secretary, an anxious young woman barely 30, gave him a nod and pointed him toward the basement. The air down there was thick with dust and age. Metal filing cabinets stood like forgotten sentinels, and rows of boxes lined perfectly stubbornly to student photos. Then student photos, then school events. Nothing. No mention of a class trip in 1947, no names he didn't already recognize. He even checked the maintenance records, the staff logs, the transportation sheets. The only buses recorded in April of 1947 were listed under Route Redacted by order of district. That struck him as deeply unusual. School districts don't redact transportation logs. Not in 1947. Not ever. He returned home that evening with a single photocopied sheet in his coat pocket, a bus maintenance log signed by someone named R. Tillman, dated April 13, 1947, reading only, "All 3 units ready for early a.m. departure. East route. Special supervision assigned." Stanley didn't recognize the name. He planned to dig more into Tillman later, but another thought had taken root. He called his friend Curtis, who had graduated from Elmridge 2 years earlier. "Hey," Stanley began, "you remember ever having Native kids in your class?" Curtis paused, then answered, "Come to think of it, no, not a single one. I remember going past Northern Ridge all the time, but I don't think we ever had a single kid from there in school." That didn't make sense. That settlement wasn't new. It had been there long before Rockfield had its own mayor. Where had all those children gone? And why did no one seem to remember them? 2 days later, Stanley returned to the cemetery where he had heard the whisper. The old woman was gone. He asked the groundskeeper, who told him her name was Alma Runningbird, one of the last living elders from Northern Ridge. She came often, always sat at that same bench, always looked east as though waiting for something much. 2 days later, Stanley returned to the same much over the church, but she left behind a single note in the donation box of the church. It read, 47 hearts. They tried to erase them, but we remember. Stanley folded the note and put it in his wallet. Later that week, he dug through the town library archives and requested every issue of the Rockfield Gazette from March to May 1947. He expected at least a mention of a school trip. Nothing. He checked the social section, the education page, even the obituaries. It was as if April had passed without a trace. Except for one minor article dated April 17th, it read, East Wing to be repurposed for administrative use. Superintendent Blake announces reallocation due to demographic adjustments. No names, no explanation, just another door quietly closed. Stanley knew something had been buried. Not forgotten, buried intentionally. And someone, maybe many someones, had worked very hard to keep it that way. Stanley Cross had always believed that answers lived in the margins, in the forgotten corners where no one bothered to look anymore. 2 weeks after his conversation with Alma Runningbird, he volunteered to assist the county clerk's office in reorganizing the archives stored above the old courthouse, a dusty attic space that had not been properly inventoried since the late 1970s. It was the kind of job most avoided: heavy boxes, the constant threat of mice, and decades of sun-stained paper, brittle and curled like autumn leaves. But for Stanley, it felt like the logical next step in a search that had begun as a whisper and was fast becoming an obsession. The attic was stifling, even in early May, sunlight slicing through the cracks in the wood, illuminating particles of dust that moved like ghosts in the air. Rows of metal shelves buckled under the weight of waterwork boxes labeled in smeared ink. Fire codes 1955-68, voter registry. Most of it was junk, carbon copies of noise complaints, duplicate tax filings, forgotten road project blueprints. But near the back, tucked behind a row of cracked file folders, Stanley noticed a wooden crate that didn't match the rest. It was smaller, unmarked, and sealed with a rusted clasp. He pried it open carefully, heart beginning to thump for reasons he couldn't explain. Inside was a stack of yellowed manila envelopes. No titles, no dates. He opened the top envelope and found a single document, a list. The paper was faded, the ink smudged in places, but the handwriting was unmistakably human, deliberate. 47 names were scrawled across the sheet in black ink, organized by age and first name. He read them slowly. Anna Brightfeather, age 8. Jonah White Elk, age 11. Naomi Clearwater, age 9. The list continued, each name a quiet weight pressing deeper into his chest. He counted them 3 times, unable to believe it. 47, each with a number beside it, presumably a class roll number, and in the upper right corner, a small notation, 3B. Stanley sat on the floor, letting the box rest in his lap. He shuffled through the rest of the contents. Most were hand-typed field reports with incomplete headers. A few were half-ripped forms titled Request for Relocation Authorization, stamped with what appeared to be the old seal of the Montana Department of Education. But one sheet caught his eye. A single page, folded in half, tucked inside a small blue folder. It was brittle, the edges torn slightly, and the handwriting barely legible. At the top, in neat cursive, Final Transit Confirmation, then underneath, in fainter pencil, April 47th, 14, departed Camp K. Under federal directive, no follow-up. That last phrase, no follow-up, was underlined twice. He read the note again, his fingers tracing the faded pencil, like it might suddenly offer more clarity. Camp K. That had to be a code or shorthand, but it wasn't familiar. He had spent most of his life reading departmental lingo and could usually decipher it, but this one didn't track with any known abbreviation from his years in law enforcement. The use of the word departed was especially curious. It didn't say relocated or reassigned, it said departed, which felt colder, more permanent. Stanley took the folder to the window and held it up to the light, hoping the contrast would reveal more. On the back of the page, faintly bleeding through, was what looked like an internal memo header: Inland Transit Services. He made a mental note of the acronym, though it didn't ring any bells. As he returned the rest of the documents to the crate, he found something else, a strip of black and white photographs like those taken in photo booths. It had been torn from a longer strip, edges jagged. In the final frame, a young girl with long braids and round eyes looked directly into the lens. Her expression was unreadable. Behind her was a wooden wall with a faded stencil. He turned it over. On the back, someone had written in red ink, "Naomi C." That night, Stanley spread everything across his dining room table, sorting documents, sketching timelines, mapping names against known family trees from the Northern Ridge community. It was a grim sort of detective work, the kind that didn't lead to arrests or trials, but to buried truths. His mind kept circling back to the phrase, "no follow-up." It suggested more than neglect. It suggested intent. Someone had not just forgotten these children, someone had ensured they would not be found again. He made photocopies of the most fragile documents and returned the originals to their box, resealing it carefully. The next morning, he brought the copies to his contact at the Regional Historical Society, a quiet archivist named Helen Wu. She had worked in the field long enough to recognize when something didn't belong. Helen studied the documents for over an hour before speaking. "These aren't state-level documents," she said at last. "Terminology, transit confirmation, Unit K. That's not how the Department of Education files things. This looks military, adjacent, or federal at least. You might be looking at something that predates full jurisdictional oversight." Stanley didn't fully understand what that meant, but he knew enough to know it wasn't good. Later that week, Stanley contacted a retired bus driver he had remembered from his early days on the force, Reuben McCall, now living in a senior home 2 towns over. When asked about April 1947, Reuben squinted and said, "That was the year I was told to drive east, out past the ridge line, took 3 loads of kids. Quiet ones, not a word spoken the whole ride." When Stanley pressed him on the destination, Reuben hesitated. Didn't ask, wasn't told. Just remember the turnoff wasn't on any map. Dirt road, trees so thick it swallowed the sun. Stanley thanked him and left, his mind now fully consumed by one question. What was Camp K? For 3 nights, Stanley barely slept. His thoughts kept spiraling around the name Naomi C., the phrase, "no follow-up," and the cold face of the girl in the torn photograph. The folder's content weighed on him like a confession no one had spoken aloud for 45 years. He knew the next step had to be human, names turned into faces, faces into memories. He began visiting Northern Ridge, a quiet settlement now home mostly to elders and their children's children. Many had moved away over the years, forced out by poverty, dwindling services, or quiet policies that made staying harder than leaving. But some remained, Stanley asked carefully, showing only the list of names, never the phrase, never the photo. Most were cautious, some skeptical, but one name kept surfacing. "You should speak to Clarice Noah," said an old man outside the tribal center. "She remembers what others tried not to." Clarice lived in a cedar-canneled house at the far end of the settlement, near a bend in the river, where the air always smelled like wet stone. She answered the door slowly, her posture upright despite the cane in her hand. Her hair was long and silver, tied back tightly. When Stanley introduced himself, she didn't blink. "Come in," she said simply. He sat on a low couch and she remained standing, watching him carefully, like someone who had lived long enough to know when a stranger came bearing something heavier than words. "You found them," she said, not as a question, but as a resigned truth. Stanley didn't answer at first, just unfolded the list gently onto her table. Her eyes scanned the names with the precision of memory, not yet dulled. When she reached line 14, Naomi Clearwater, her fingers paused. "I was supposed to go that day," she began. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the table's edge. "I was 9. My mother had packed my overnight things in a pillowcase, new socks, a boiled egg, 2 spring berries. I remember that morning, The sky was quiet, too quiet for spring. I had a fever. I was sweating and dizzy, and my mother wouldn't let me leave the house. I cried. I wanted to be with the others. She looked up at Stanley. That was the last time I saw any of them. Stanley leaned forward. Do you remember anything unusual about the days before? Anyone visiting the school? Changes in routine? Clarice nodded. The Friday before, Ms. Klein stayed late after class. She looked tired, not just physically, something else, scared maybe. And on Monday, she wasn't alone. A man came with her. He wore a uniform, not police, not military exactly, but dark green, formal, like something from a federal agency. She paused, eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, didn't look at us, he only looked at us. That was it. That was the signal. Stanley's heart pounded. Do you remember what happened after? She exhaled slowly. She read out names. Each child stepped forward, picked up their bag. No one asked questions. No one refused. That man stood at the door of the classroom the whole time, silent. As they left, I saw her mouth something under her breath. I think she said, "Forgive me." But I can't be sure. Then the buses came, and the rest is silent. She walked into another room and returned with a small box. This is all I've kept from that time. Inside were a few black and white photos, a child's bracelet, and a worn slip of paper with doodles. At the bottom, a child's scribble read, Naomi C. says we'll see snow again. Clarice touched the paper softly. She was my best friend. Stanley felt the weight of the years pressing into his chest. These weren't just names on a list. They were lives, abandoned in daylight, erased without alarm. Did anyone ever come asking? Journalists, police, government workers? He asked. Clara shook her head. Not once. We filed reports, we begged for answers, but the school said the class had been relocated and the state said they had no such records. After a while, people stopped asking. Not because they stopped caring, but because they saw what happened when you did. Stanley sat in silence, unsure how to respond. The walls of Clara's home were covered in woven tapestries, hand-carved masks, family photographs, evidence of generations persisting despite history's attempts to write them out. Clarice poured tea into 2 cups, her movements slow but deliberate. You said you were from Rockfield, she said quietly. You must have walked those same halls. Did you ever wonder why there weren't any of us in your class? Stanley hesitated. Not until now, he admitted. I assumed things. I never asked. Clarice nodded, not unkindly. That's how they win, not with violence, with forgetting. She lifted her cup, then paused. You found something, didn't you? Not just the names. Stanley reached into his coat and pulled out the photocopied memo. He placed it gently on the table. She read it once, then again. Her face hardened. Camp K, she whispered. Claire always said the K stood for kindness, that it was a learning center, but my uncle said it felt more like a holding place. He used to work for the maintenance crews, said they built something out by the old hollow. Stanley's pulse quickened. Do you know where? Claire nodded slowly. I can show you, but you won't like what's left. The next morning, Stanley awoke with Clarice's voice still echoing in his mind, the image of her faded bracelet and Naomi's childlike scrawl haunting his thoughts like a shadow that refused to lift. Her mention of the hollow, of Camp K, and of the unnamed man in uniform had reopened something dark and buried, not just within the community, but within Stanley himself. As he sat at his kitchen table sipping black coffee that had gone cold, he realized he needed something tangible, something that could bridge memory and record. He remembered the old school district photo archive housed in the basement of the Rockfield Public Library, a place where time had a way of staying still. That afternoon he visited the librarian, an older woman named Doreen who still filed cards by hand and wore her glasses on a pearl chain. When he asked for access to class photos from the 1940s, she raised an eyebrow. You're not the first one to ask, she said absently. But the early files are spotty. A lot went missing during renovations in '67. Still, she led him down the narrow stairs, unlocking a room that smelled of aged paper and lemon polish. Cabinets stood in rows, their drawers labeled by year and grade. Stanley pulled open the drawer marked 1947, and after sifting through curled black and white portraits, he found it. A class photo labeled Grade 3B, April 1947, Miss Elmridge. But something was wrong. The top right corner of the photo had been torn away deliberately, not by time or accident. It was a clean rip, as if someone had intentionally removed a part of the past. Still, the remaining image showed nearly 40 children standing in 3 uneven rows. Their faces, though blurred by age, revealed something unsettling. They weren't smiling, none of them, and at the far left, almost outside the frame, stood Miss Meredith Klein. She wasn't posing like the others. While the children stared at the camera, Meredith's body was angled away, her posture rigid. Her eyes looked directly into the lens, but there was something desperate in her gaze. Not fear exactly, but a silent warning, as if she knew the photo might be the last trace of something no one would ever speak of again. Stanley's fingers trembled slightly as he slid the photo into a protective sleeve. He thanked Doriel and promised to return it later, though he had no intention of doing so. Back home, he scanned the image at high resolution, enhancing the grainy details. When he zoomed in on Meredith's face, he noticed a subtle detail he hadn't seen before. Her left hand, half cropped by the frame, held what looked like a folded piece of paper, small, square, like a note clutched too tightly. It could have been nothing, but in the context of everything Claire's had said, it felt like something. He opened the State Education Directory database, an outdated system he still had access to through his retirement credentials. He typed in Klein, Meredith Faculty, 1947. The screen returned a single entry, K-Line, May, Elmridge Public School, Grade 3B status, transferred, May 14, 1947. That was all. No new school listed, no district ID. He expanded the search statewide. No results. Not in Montana, not in any neighboring counties. It was as if Meredith Klein had disappeared the moment the buses left Elmridge. He cross-referenced employee tax records, teacher union rosters, even obituary databases. Still nothing. No death certificate, no marriage license, no record of relocation. Stanley sat back in his chair, the hume of the desk lamp buzzing faintly. He was staring at an absence, the deliberate erasure of someone who had once stood before a class of children and watched them vanish. He called Helen Wu again, asking for assistance with tracking personnel files from the 1940s. She was silent for a long time before replying. If she was part of something federal, or if someone higher decided she needed to vanish, her file may never have existed in any public system. You might be chasing a shadow, but Stanley wasn't ready to stop. The next day, he drove to the home of an old colleague, Edgar Marin, who had served on the Rockfield School Board for over 3 decades. Edgar greeted him with cautious warmth, ushering him into a sunroom filled with dying houseplants and stacks of old records. When Stanley asked about Meredith Klein, Edgar shook his head slowly. "That name," he said, "it was never supposed to come up again." Stanley leaned in. "What do you mean?" Edgar hesitated, then stood and rifled through a filing cabinet marked confidential/obsolete. He returned with a manila folder that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside was a single page from a 1947 meeting transcript. At the bottom was a handwritten note in red ink. No discussion, the rest was blacked out. "Whose request?" Stanley asked. Edgar looked away. "Back then we got directives from Helena that came without signatures. They just said, 'Handle it.' And we did." Stanley stared at the note, his pulse quickening. Meredith Klein hadn't just transferred, she had been silenced, moved, buried, erased. And yet she had left behind that photo, her face frozen in that final moment, eyes wide with something between regret and urgency. He needed more. Not just memories, not just names. He needed a place. The photograph of Meredith Klein stayed with Stanley like a thorn beneath the skin, impossible to forget and painful to ignore. Her expression, the note she might have clutched, and the complete erasure from all institutional records had turned her from a teacher into a cipher, a clue buried beneath layers of official silence. But it was Claridge's words that truly haunted him. They said the K stood for kindness, and it felt more like a holding place. The implication in her voice was not metaphorical. That was why, 3 days later, Stanley drove out to Northern Ridge again, where the river coiled like a sleeping serpent and the light always felt filtered through something ancient. Clarice met him outside her home, already wearing a coat, a folded map in her hand, and a canvas satchel over her shoulder. "I've only been there once," she said. "I was 17. My father took me hunting and pointed it out from the ridge, said it was better to forget. But I never did." They drove together in Stanley's old Jeep, the tires crunching over gravel roads that thinned into packed earth, then into twin ruts lined by thick brush. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Even the birds fell silent. After an hour, Claire Miga pointed to a gap in the trees where the hill sloped into a shallow basin. "There," she said. "That's Coyote Hollow." The Jeep couldn't go any farther, so they walked the rest of the way, branches scraping their arms and leaves crackling beneath their boots. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. As they descended into the hollow, the first thing Stanley noticed was how unnatural the silence felt. No insects, no rustling wind, just the sound of their steps and their breath. Then he saw it. Half covered in moss and lichen, a square of poured concrete lay flat in the center of the clearing, measuring about 20 feet on each side. Its edges were cracked, and weeds pushed through the seams, but the shape was unmistakable. At one end stood a low stone wall, no higher than his knee, made of stacked river rock, some scorched black, others chipped as if from tools. Nearby, under a collapsed pine limb, he noticed something glinting in the sunlight. He brushed away the debris and uncovered a rusted tricycle wheel, still attached to a bent metal frame. A few feet away, buried partially in the soil, was a small red whistle, its plastic faded and chewed at one end. Farther back, beside a row of rocks that might have once formed a fire pit, he uncovered the skeletal remains of a wooden bench and a piece of fabric patterned with faded stripes. Claire stood at the edge, her arms crossed tightly. "My father said this used to be a dormitory," she murmured. "They called it a temporary transition site, just for a few weeks. But he heard stories, children being loaded onto trucks in the dark, no records, no promises. Just orders." Stanley took photographs of everything, careful not to disturb too much. He marked the coordinates on his notepad and drew a rough map. There was no sign of signage, no indication of what the site had once been, officially. Just the shape of a erasure pressed into the land like a scar. That night, back at home, Stanley logged into the regional property record system, using the coordinates as federal wilderness, untouched, unzoned, and listed under no development permitted. There was no mention of prior construction, no record of permit requests, utility hookups, or land leases. It was as if the foundation, the wall, and the toys had appeared out of thin air. He tried zoning records from 1940 through 1950. Still nothing, not even a hint of a temporary structure. He dug deeper, contacting a friend from the Bureau of Land Management who owed him a favor. The man agreed to run a search through their older physical archive, promising to call if anything surfaced. In the meantime, Stanley went back through the documents he had retrieved from the courthouse attic. One sheet caught his attention anew, a fuel requisition form signed by a name he hadn't noticed before. Supervisor W. Kent, Inland Trans. The date matched April 13, 1947. The fuel was designated for 3 units, Eastern Extraction, Camp K. He froze. Extraction, not transport, not field trip. Extraction. The language alone suggested something covert, something that required euphemism. And there, typed faintly at the bottom, were initials, DOIR, Department of Indigenous Relations. It wasn't an acronym he had seen used officially, not in state-level work. He cross-referenced the initials with federal documents and came up dry, until he stumbled upon a declassified internal memo from 1946 referencing new interdepartmental procedures for child relocation under Project Integration. The memo was vague, dense with bureaucratic language, but it mentioned establishing temporary rural way stations in partnership with regional educational boards. The tone was clinical, but the intent was chilling. Stanley returned to Coyote Hollow 2 days later, alone this time. He brought a metal detector, though the rocky ground and interference from nearby minerals made readings sporadic. Still, near the edge of the concrete slab, the detector beeped. He dug carefully and unearthed a rusted nameplate, warped and barely legible. After cleaning it gently with a cloth, the letters became clear. Property of Transit Authority, Unit K. rotation 1B. His throat tightened. It was the first physical link he had found between the place and the documents. Before leaving, he walked the perimeter one last time, noting how the surrounding forest pressed in like a secret, trying to remain hidden. As he stood at the center of the concrete, he imagined the children, 47 young bodies in sleeping bags, lined up for head counts, meals served in silence, games never played again. The sense of abandonment was overwhelming. He took one last photo and turned to leave. That night, when he developed the images, something caught his eye. In the background of one frame, barely visible through the trees, was a shape, rectangular, metallic, half sunken into the earth. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't part of the foundation. He printed it. For 3 days, Stanley could barely function. The image of that metal structure hidden behind the trees haunted him. Its straight lines, an affront to the natural world it had been buried in. He didn't sleep, barely ate, and when he spoke with Clarice again, she said nothing, just placed her hand gently on his shoulder, as if to say, "You know now." But knowing wasn't enough. He needed something official, something irrefutable, something that would take this out of the realm of forgotten memories and force it into the light of historical fact. So he did what he had never done in his 30 years of law enforcement. He filed a FOIA request. The Freedom of Information Act had its limits, but he knew just enough about how to word a demand so that it couldn't be dismissed without some level of disclosure. He kept the language specific and clinical, requesting all documentation relating to Camp K, Transit Authority Unit K, or Project Integration 1B, dated between 19-45195, 0 from any branch of the Department of Interior, Department of Indigenous Affairs, or related federal agencies. He expected the standard 3-month wait, maybe a heavily redacted page or two, but 2 weeks later, a thin manila envelope arrived in the mail, stamped, processed per expedited clearance. Inside was a single document, a 2-page memorandum marked, Federal Archive copy only, not for reproduction. The memo, dated April 3, 1947, was addressed from the Office of Interdepartmental Coordination, Washington, D.C., and carried a heading that made Stanley's blood run cold. Subject: Implementation of Integration Trial Directive 1B, Camp K. He read it slowly, then again, each word confirming what he had feared. As per joint authorization by the Office of Indian Affairs and the Department of Education, Transit Site K will initiate intake on April 14, 7 under the Integration Trial Directive 1B. 47 minors selected from Elmridge District to participate in Voluntary Cultural Conversion Program, noted program. Goals: assimilation, behavioral restructuring, identity standardization occurred after identity reassignment. Guardianship to be distributed via interstate adoption agreements, no follow-up to be scheduled. The words were clinical, sterile, but their implications were monstrous. Integration, identity standardization, guardianship distribution. It wasn't a school trip, it wasn't relocation. It was cultural erasure, codified into policy and cloaked in bureaucratic freezing. The second page of the memo listed roles: Field Operative, Kent, W, Permission, Klein, M. Logistics, Klein, Marie. Meredith Klein's name, now confirmed as a participant in the system, filled Stan. Whether by coercion or complicity, she had been part of the machine. He set the papers down, his hands shaking. For the first time since this began, he felt nauseous. Not because of what he'd discovered, but because of how cleanly it had all been done. There were no bullets, no shackles, no blood. Just forms, titles, directives. They had taken children, erased their names, changed their clothes, and scattered them like seeds into places that would never know their roots. He shared the memo with Helen Wu, who read it in total silence. "This wasn't a rogue operation," she said finally. "This was policy, and if 1B was a pilot, then there were others." Stanley nodded grimly. "It means Rockfield was just one site." That night, he sat in his office, surrounded by photocopies, newspaper archives, and faded photographs. He compiled everything into a binder, one he titled not by case number, but by name. The 46. He traced the language in the memo again: identity, reassignment, interstate adoption agreements. Somewhere out there, the children who had been taken might still be alive, but under different names, different stories, rewritten pasts. He didn't know if that made it better or worse. The idea that they had survived, unaware of who they truly were, was its own kind of tragedy. Her voice was quiet. "I think I remember something," she said. "When I was 13, my aunt showed me a letter. It was from a woman in Missouri. She claimed her son had been adopted in 1950. He was 10, looked like her brother, she said, looked native, but the record said he was from Minnesota." Stanley's heart skipped. "Do you still have the letter?" Claire sighed. "It's buried in a box somewhere. I looked." That afternoon, he checked federal adoption records for 1947 through 1952. Over 300 cases matched the criteria of children aged 7 to 13 adopted across state lines. From unlisted guardianships, most had been processed through small private agencies or churches, many of which no longer existed. Some files had been digitized, others were marked as sealed per statute. To access them, he received a denial notice. Access restricted due to privacy protections enacted under 1972 Guardianship Safeguards Act. But a few names were visible, names that didn't match birth certificates from any known family registry in Montana. He cross-seconded 5 of them with the original list of the 47. 2 shared exact birth dates. The names had changed, but the dates and locations of adoption matched too perfectly to be coincidence. One had been adopted by a couple in Kansas, the other had ended up in Georgia. Both were listed as having no previous medical or educational records, only a generic state custody transfer, minor 1B. Stanley felt the noose tighten. This wasn't just about what had happened in Rockfield, it was about what had been allowed to happen across an entire system, unquestioned, unrecorded, and unreversed. Stanley hadn't intended to go public, at least not yet. But Helen had convinced him that sometimes, when institutions stay silent, you have to let the people speak. So he'd written a short column in the local paper, careful with his words, vague on specifics. It was published under the title, "Echoes from Elmridge, a sheriff's search for 47 lost names." The piece had been printed in a Sunday edition of the Rockfield Gazette, picked up by a few regional outlets, and quietly passed along through online genealogy forums and Indigenous advocacy circles. He hadn't expected much, but 3 weeks later a letter arrived from Oregon, postmarked Eugene, with neat cursive handwriting across the envelope. Read, "Your article on the 47." Inside was a typed note and a photograph of a woman in her 50s standing in front of a woman's cabin, her features strikingly similar to Clara Canoa, same high cheekbones, same piercing eyes. Her name was Lena Cross. She was 57. She had grown up in Coos Bay, adopted by a white family when she was just 3 years old. The letter read, "I've always known something didn't add up. My parents, kind as they were, never knew much about where I came from. The adoption agency in Nebraska told them I had no living relatives, no birth certificate, just a file number, Child 47, K. Hollow Batch. When I read your article and saw that phrase, K. Hollow, I felt my stomach drop. I've never seen it anywhere else, until now." Stanley called her the next morning. Lena's voice was calm, deliberate. She explained how the phrase, K. Hollow Batch, had haunted her for years. It was written in red ink at the bottom of her adoption summary, which she had found by accident during a move 10 years ago. She had contacted multiple state agencies, but none had records older than 1965. "It felt like my life began mid-sentiments," she said. "No beginning, just a name someone gave me." Stanley asked if she had ever done a DNA test. She had, twice. Both times, results had linked her distantly to families from northern Montana. But the matches were weak, scattered. No close relatives had ever surfaced. Stanley asked her to scan and send everything she had. The documents arrived by email within hours. The scanned adoption form was dated July 12, 1948. The adoption agency was listed as Midland Youth Services, Lincoln Branch. It no longer existed. The child's name was blank. Only the designation, Child 47B, was typed under identification. There was no birth certificate, no medical record, just a one-page behavioral assessment that described the child as quiet, cooperative, limited language upon arrival. The words struck Stanley like a hammer. It fit the pattern Clarice had described, the silence, the obedience, the absence of records. He pulled the roster from the box in his study, the list of the 47. Line 47, Naomi Clearwater, age 9. He stared at the name for a long moment. He had never been Naomi. He sent Lena be Naomi. He sent Clarice the photo of Lena. It took less than a minute for her to reply, "She has Naomi's eyes." Stanley knew it wasn't scientific, but in this case memory was its own kind of evidence. He called Lena back and asked if she'd be willing to come to Montana. She didn't hesitate. "I need to know who I am," she said, "and if I'm one of them, I need to help finish what they started." 4 days later she arrived in Rockfield. When she and Clarice met, there was no dramatic embrace, no tears, just a long, quiet moment of recognition between two women who had been severed by time, but linked by something deeper than blood. Clarice brought out the bracelet, the same one Lena had described seeing in a recurring dream she never understood. It was small, made of woven thread and carved beads. When she held it in her hand, Lena's fingers trembled. Stanley watched as Lena touched the moss-covered stones at Coyote Hollow, tracing the cracked concrete with her palm. She stood for nearly an hour without speaking. Later, over coffee, she told him about fragmented memories, of cold floors, a woman with a clipboard, a uniformed man who never smiled, of being woken up at night and placed into a different room with fewer children each morning, of one morning, standing alone, handed a coat and a bag, put on a train, and told, "This is your new beginning." She hadn't spoken for months after arriving at her adoptive home. Her parents thought she was mute, but eventually the words returned, except they were in English. She had no memory of what came before. Stanley asked if she'd ever been called Naomi. She shook her head. "Lena was the only name I've known, but Clarice was sure. She was always the last in line, always smallest. The others used to say she had snow in her hair." Lena nodded slowly. "I used to have nightmares about snow falling inside, like it was coming down through the roof." He filed for a legal DNA test, not for confirmation, though that would come, but to begin a process. If they could match Lena to Naomi, maybe others could be found too. Maybe this wasn't the end, but the first light breaking through decades of deliberate darkness. Stanley worked on the report for 9 days straight, rarely sleeping, eating only when Clarice reminded him to, and cross-checking every document with obsessive precision. He compiled a full timeline, from the April 1947 memo authorizing Integration Trial Directive 1B to the handwritten list of the 47, the Coyote Hollow, the testimony from Clarice Noah, and Lena Cross's matching adoption record. He included high-resolution scans of the memo, transcriptions of oral testimonies, geographical surveys of the hollow site, and DNA evidence pending results. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a documented historical event, hidden beneath bureaucratic language and purposeful omission. When he finished, it was 40 pages long, bound in a leather binder with tabs, appendices, and an executive summary that ended with a single sentence. If this is not evidence of a deliberate erasure, then history itself is complicit. He submitted it to the Montana State Historical Oversight Board, the Department of Education, and the Office of Indigenous Affairs. He made sure each received a certified copy. For a week, he heard nothing. Then, on a Monday morning, a plain envelope arrived, no letterhead, just a typed response. It was brief. "Your submitted material has been reviewed. Due to insufficient verifiable legal evidence and chain of custody concerns regarding materials dated pre-1960, we are unable to take further action or endorse public dissemination at this time. Please cease distribution of unverified materials." It was signed by a deputy undersecretary. At the bottom was a stamped red notice, "Subject to review under Archival Defamation Protocols, Section 14, Clause 3. Stanley stared at the letter, the silence in his kitchen broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. He read it twice, then set it down, walked outside, and sat on the front step with his head in his hands. They hadn't just rejected the report, they had buried it again, sealed it under language so sanitized it sounded like a dismissal, not of facts, but of memory itself. He knew that kind of language. He had used it himself years ago when shutting down cases deemed too politically volatile. It wasn't a denial, it was a warning. But the story had already escaped. A week before mailing the final version, Stanley had sent a draft to a small independent journalist in Missoula named Tara Medina, someone he trusted. Tara had once exposed financial fraud in the county school system and wasn't afraid of stories that made officials squirm. She ran a blog and a podcast with a modest but loyal following. After reading the report, she posted a feature titled "The 40th 7: What Happened at Coyote Hollow." The article went live the same day Stanley received the rejection. By nightfall, it had over 10,000 shares. Within 48 hours, it was picked up by the regional outlet, Mountain Voice, and syndicated through native networks nationwide. The comments section flooded with names, stories, fragments of memory. Clara's phone rang non-stop. So did Stanley's. Families from across the Northern Territories, Ridgeview, Pine Mesa, Clearwater Valley, began reaching out. Some remembered siblings who never came home from school. Others had locked boxes in their basements filled with letters returned unopened, marked "No recipient found." A woman in Wyoming produced a photo of a classroom identical to the torn one Stanley had found, but with a full border, one that included a banner reading "Integration Batch, April 47." Another family found a letter addressed to a school teacher, postmarked July 1947, Phase 1B. None of these had ever been shared publicly before. One man, now in his 70s, recalled seeing buses leave the Elmridge school grounds that day, flanked by black sedans. "They said it was a field trip," he wrote, "but we knew field trips didn't need that many men in suits." Another woman, then only 6, remembered her older brother Jonah being told to pack a small bag. He waved from the back of the bus. "Mama waited at the stop for a week." A retired postal worker admitted that she had been instructed to divert all mail addressed to the 3B students during that month. "I didn't understand why. I just followed orders." Photos emerged, faded, creased, some half-burned, children in school uniforms that didn't match the ones issued by Elmridge. Group shots in front of plain buildings, faces blurred by age and time, but unmistakably similar to the names on Stanley's list. A teacher's diary surfaced from an estate sale containing a single line dated April 14, 1947. "They took the children. I didn't ask where." As the voices multiplied, the story could no longer be framed as speculative history. It was memory rising from the soil, from shoeboxes and closets and desk drawers. The 47 were becoming more than names. They were reappearing as a collective wound, finally reopening under sunlight. The Montana State Historical Oversight Board issued a brief statement 2 days later claiming they were looking into allegations regarding educational displacement in mid-century programs. But for the people who had waited decades for acknowledgement, it was too little, too late. Stanley kept every message, printed every photo, archived every testimony. He created a digital repository and named it Coyote Hollow Voices. When a news crew from Denver arrived in Rockfield to film a segment, Stanley didn't give them sound bites. He gave them names. Claria stood beside him. Lena told her story to the camera without hesitation. She ended it simply. "We were not lost. We were taken." The storm that followed the news reports refused to quiet. In the months after Lena Cross's televised testimony, more records surfaced, some anonymously mailed, others leaked by former state employees who had remained silent for decades. A janitor who had worked at the Department of Youth Services had begun with an apprentice, 970S, came forward with a storage locker full of old filing boxes he'd rescued from the trash. Among the yellow documents were inter-gab ship memos, handwritten directives, and red-stamped orders, all referencing integration trials, Camp K, and child relocation efficacy. The media continued to push. What had begun as a local investigation spiraled into a statewide reckoning. Under mounting pressure, the Montana State Legislature called for an independent truth committee, one tasked with compiling findings, collecting testimonies, and determining if a formal apology or prosecution was warranted. Stanley was invited to speak at the committee's first meeting. Claire Lee came with him, as did Lena. The room in Helena was packed. It was late autumn 1995, and the wind outside sounded like memory scratching at the windows. Cameras lined the walls. Elders sat in the front row. A painting of the Montana Capitol hung over the dais like a witness. The hearing lasted for 3 days. Survivors spoke, Witnesses cried. One after another, names once erased returned to the air. Lena described the moment she realized her first name was never heard. Clarence recounted the empty desk beside her after Naomi didn't return. A retired driver, now 87, confessed he had been paid in cash to drive children without papers across county lines, then told to forget. On the final day, a man stepped forward. His name was Charles Brenner. He had been a junior administrator in the Department of Education from 1946 to 1950. His hand shook as he unfolded his prepared statement. "We're told it was about unity," he began. "There would never be a strong country unless we had a single kind of citizen. They called it educational streamlining. But the truth is, we were ordered to erase the indigenous bloc from certain districts, Rockfield among them. The directive came from higher than state level. We weren't told why. We were told to make it clean." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Stanley watched the legislators shift in their seats, their expressions tight. "Signed forms that reclassified children as wards of the state," Charles continued. "We knew they'd be adopted out of state. We knew their names would be changed. Some of us thought we were saving them, but most of us just wanted to keep our jobs. I'm sorry." "It won't bring them back, but I am sorry." The official report, issued 4 months later, called it a deliberate program of cultural disintegration carried out under administrative camouflage. It cited direct violations of civil and human rights. The findings didn't result in criminal charges. Too much time had passed, too many responsible had died. But it led to something long overdue. In the spring of 1996, Rockfield broke ground on a memorial site where the Elmridge School had once stood. Stanley, Clarice, Lena, and dozens of others stood in silence as the first of 47 granite pillars was raised. Each pillar bore the name of a child confirmed to have vanished on April 14, 1947. If the child had been found or identified under a new name, that name was inscribed beside the original. Naomi Clearwater, Lena Cross. Some names remained alone, unpaired, still waiting to be reclaimed. The final pillar bore no name, only a phrase. "For the voices still missing, may they find their way home." A plaque at the front of the memorial read, in both English and Crow, "We remember you, and this time no one gets to forget." Stanley stepped back, the wind carrying through the trees in soft currents. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the nearby school, rebuilt 2 blocks east. Clarice held a folded paper in her hand, the original list creased and worn, now laminated and safe. Lena placed a small red whistle at the base of her pillar, the one she'd found in the hollow, now polished clean. There were no speeches that day, only silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not closure, perhaps, but acknowledgement. It had taken nearly half a century for the truth to be spoken aloud, and though the children had been taken, scattered, renamed, forgotten by systems built to erase them, their return, through memory, through voice, through stone, was a testament that even the most buried history can surface when someone dares to dig. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true mystery narratives that uncover forgotten truths. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Do you think the children ever truly found peace? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.